And at Bolton's first public speaking engagement after he was fired, he gave a shocking warning. He said if President Trump is reelected and gets a second term, he thinks one of the things that Trump will do in his second term is he'll pull the United States out of NATO. NATO, of course, is the transatlantic alliance set up at the end of World War II to, among other things, provide a unified Western counterweight and a unified Western check against what was then the Soviet Union. NATO has shaped the Western world since World War II. That alliance is arguably why there has never been a World War III. But the first thing John Bolton said after he got fired as Trump's national security advisor is if he gets a second term, he's going to destroy NATO. He's going to pull the United States out of it. And as crazy as that might sound, last week when Trump was in London for the NATO summit, NATO leaders, world leaders at that summit, came to that summit prepared to do damage control should he announce abruptly at that summit that, in fact, the U.S. is pulling out of NATO. World leaders literally had a plan amongst themselves. They had a plan ready in the event that Trump announced on a whim that the U.S. was ditching NATO, because that seemed to them like a realistic prospect. Well, now today, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee did something sort of remarkable. They passed a resolution on a bipartisan basis that requires congressional approval if President Trump were to try to withdraw from NATO. This is Democrats and Republicans, a bipartisan vote here. Democrats and Republicans essentially making defensive maneuvers here, playing defense about what the president might do next. Just a remarkable move today on a resolution sponsored by Democratic Senator Tim Kaine. Now, the House is casting its impeachment actions basically along the same lines, saying that they're moving with speed, they're moving with alacrity because they need to defend the country. They need Congress to move, to act, to defend the country from what the president is trying to do next in this context, too.
The president's misconduct goes to the heart of whether we can conduct a free and fair election in 2020. It is bad enough for a candidate to invite foreign interference in our political process, but it is far more corrosive for a president to do so and to abuse his power to make it so.
As the House gets ready to vote now, and the impeachment articles will then head over from the House to the Senate for the president's trial, what happens to this dynamic, this sort of operative principle we are seeing quietly at work, even in bipartisan ways, to basically try to protect the country from the president's actions and from what the Congress is worried he might do next? Joining us now is Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia. He's a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Sir, it's great to have you here tonight. Thanks for being here.
You bet. Glad to be back, Rachel.
So let me ask you about this NATO provision. This is a remarkable vote today in the Foreign Relations Committee on NATO, bipartisan support for your legislation to essentially block the president from unilaterally busting up NATO. Are you seriously concerned that he may be angling to do that?
Rachel, I am worried about it. And in fact, this bill, it was one of the last bills that John McCain introduced. He and I introduced it together shortly before he died. And we introduced it then because we were so worried that all the president's bashing of NATO suggested, A, that he might leave, and that he clearly believed that he could do it on its own. As you know, NATO is a treaty that was ratified by the Senate. So the president thinking I can get out of it on my own worried us both. We introduced it, and over time, in this year, it's the 70th anniversary of NATO. We see the president continues to say negative things about NATO. There was reporting in the New York Times recently that they've actively discussed pulling out of NATO. And at the NATO meeting last week, you saw French President Macron saying that NATO is now brain dead because of the real lack of U.S. commitment from the president to NATO. So we've just slowly built a consensus among Democrats and Republicans that the alliance has value, that the only benefactor if the U.S. pulled out of NATO would be Vladimir Putin and Russia. And we want to make clear to our allies and to the president, and especially to Russia, that the Congress supports the U.S. staying in NATO, and we're not going to let a president back out of it on his own.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.